All right, welcome to another episode of Pursuit.
You sound very happy to be here.
I am. We're gonna be. I think we finished everything on finding truth. If you didn't find truth, go rewatch the episodes. And
Or tell us what we missed.
you don't have to.
You can always come back.
And today we're gonna kind of shift focus, I guess. Talk about a very familiar story. The story of the Good Samaritan. So, what do you guys know of the story? What do you remember? Either one of you.
So we actually taught this a couple of weeks ago with the kids.
Did you really? All right, so go for it.
So there was he a Jew? Right? He was on his way to like wherever he was going, and he was basically mugged, beat up, and left on the side of the road. Concur?
You just said you taught it
I
to a bunch of
know.
little kids.
I'm just making sure we're all on the same page. So as the day goes on, he's there, he's bruised, he's beaten, he's on the street, and then a few people come by, like throughout the course of the day, and a lot of times they went around him. So one of them was a pastor, one of them, or like a priest. One was like, I don't remember what everyone was. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We do a lot of things.
Sure.
But I think that the moral of the story was that it was a Samaritan who Samaritans generally don't get along with the Jews, that took the time out, excuse me, to one, see if he was okay, make sure like he was still like, conscious, like things were okay. And then he also took him to where he could reside and he could stay until he was better and he was like, able to go out on his own. And no one would have expected it because it was a Samaritan.
Care to add anything to that?
I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know that much. I'm learning as much as you guys are.
All right. So, the what?
What?
I said we love an honest queen.
The Good Samaritan story, right? We see it in Luke chapter 10 verses. The story itself is from verse 30, right? So 37, right? Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, and yes, more or less, I think you kind of hit all the main points of the story. Before we talk about this story, right? Because I know a lot of people talk about being a good Samaritan. Even now in the news, you still see the term "that was a good Samaritan" pop up when like a bystander does something kind of heroic and like stop someone from getting mugged. Oh, it's a good Samaritan and things like that. I want to just read a portion of scripture that takes place right. It's the reason why Jesus is telling the story, right? So it's Luke 10:25 to 29. I guess I'll read the NLT.
Are you sure?
I'm sure. One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" The man answered him, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Right," Jesus told him, "do this and you will live." The man wanted to justify his actions, right? Another translation, I think, says wanted to test Jesus as well, asked, "And who is my neighbor?" And then Jesus responds with the story of the Good Samaritan. Okay, so we have that story there, right? Jesus responds with the story of the Good Samaritan, and then he actually ends the story by saying, which of these three men was the neighbor to the man who was attacked? Everyone says, well, it's obviously the Samaritan. That's why you call the story the Good Samaritan. Jesus says, now go and do the same. So, with that, there's a lot of things we can say about this story. The first I want to say is, and maybe this goes more so to you, Ariel, as you are more familiar with the story right now. Putting in context the reason why Jesus tells this story. Does it change some of your thoughts on it or anything like that?
The fact that he was saying like anyone can be a neighbor, that you should.
Well, no, the fact that Jesus used this story to reply to this religious expert as to
Oh.
who is your neighbor and how do I inherit eternal life and these kind of questions.
Yes and no, because I feel like growing up, like we've a lot of times, like I've grown up in this church specifically my whole life, right? So over the course of like Sunday school and stuff, we've discussed the story in many different contexts and from different avenues. So we have discussed the fact that it was a religious leader that was trying to test Jesus and be like, oh, well, who's your neighbor and why should we be doing this? So it's not like a completely new thought to me, but it is one less discussed. So the fact that he had to tell a religious leader, like, you need to care for all people, regardless of the fact that there's someone that you, like, for generations that you don't get along with, or like you don't associate with, it's a little like what? Like, why does this something that needs to be said to a religious leader? Like, the Bible preaches love, it preaches forgiveness, it preaches that, New Testament more so than Old, I guess, preaches more so the fact that
So the quote of love the Lord your God is from the Old Testament.
yeah.
Right. So Jesus, we attribute it to the New Testament because that's when Jesus is saying it. But if you look, I believe it's found in Deuteronomy, right, which is the book of like jobs and like duty, right? That's Deuteronomy, right? So like I was trying so hard not to say that word because I knew it was gonna come out weird. But again, yes, continue.
Where was I going?
We don't talk about the fact that it was a religious leader that
But
didn't know this.
the fact that he had to tell a religious leader that you need to love everyone it's always the part that's like boggled my mind.
And Asha, coming into this fresh, never heard the story before, didn't know it existed in the Bible. How do you feel about it now?
I don't think she said all that.
And I'll clarify some things just so we're on the same page, right? There are three men who find a Jewish man beaten on the ground, right? The first is described as a priest, the second as a temple assistant, right? And the third is a Samaritan. The reason, and the man that's beaten is Jewish. The reason it's important to understand these four things are the four classifications is that Samaritans were half Jewish and were looked down upon by full Jewish people, right? You'll also remember that's why when Jesus goes to the well and he speaks to the Samaritan woman, even she's like, why are you talking to me, right? Because there was this sense of Jewish people are better than Samaritans, right? Because they were a mixed people, right? So the story ends with the person who you would least likely think of helping the Jewish person. With that, go.
What was your question, though?
I'm not gonna lie, I don't even remember the question.
Yeah,
right
you
now.
were telling me the story, and I don't.
I think it was something about with adding in the context of Jesus is being challenged as to who is your neighbor by a religious expert. Some translations say he's a lawyer, right? So with that in mind, what do you think of this story now? Just fresh heard thoughts. Go.
There are many thoughts, but can you come back to me?
Yes, I'll come back to you.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we see happen here, right, is there is an idea of being interrupted in life, right? Um, and yes, for those that are familiar with the story, we could easily talk about the idea of why is it that the Samaritan is a good person, this and that. And I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory in the story, right? He helped the guy that was beaten, took him to essentially like a place where the guy could rest and recover. He paid the bill for it. Great guy. It really should be the Great Samaritan, right? Um, but again, within the context of what's happening, right? Jesus gets interrupted, right? Then you see in the story these three men who are traveling, really four men, right? The first guy gets interrupted. His interruption is he's attacked by bandits or robbers, whatever you want to call them. The next three men get interrupted by a half dead naked man on the floor, right? And you see their response. Two men ignore it. One person, for lack of a better word, he leans into the interruption, right? Now, Jesus is obviously using the story talking again about um, who's your neighbor, right? But when it comes now to interruptions, how do you view interruptions in your life, right? Because I think God, we see God move sometimes in those interruptions. Anyone?
I think it's easy to see them as like an inconvenience or like something outside of your plan that you're not. Well, obviously, no one expects or no one anticipates an interruption within their plan. So it's easy to see it as a negative experience. But a lot of times I've found that in those interruptions, I've kind of grown more than I would have had they not been there. So, with that mindset of after that's happened, I've found that I've grown. You kind of try to look at it with a different mindset. Like, what is it that I am supposed to be learning that I haven't learned as a result of this circumstance or the situation so far?
For me, I feel like, well, I think that comes to mind is like, like when you're like talking, maybe like just saying things that you shouldn't, and someone interrupts you and kind of like redirects you to where you're actually like supposed to be going. Like, I think that that's what, like as you said, I think when you're interrupted, you can kind of like view as it being a negative thing, but sometimes it's God's redirection within that interruption that gets you to where you need to go.
You know what I always kind of wonder what would happen. And now obviously Jesus is telling a made up story to get a point across, right? But I kind of wonder what would happen to this Jewish man when he recovers to realize that this person that he looks down upon is the one that saved him.
Question.
Yes.
I know that there's like a rift between Jews and Samaritans,
Yes.
right? But can you say without a doubt that all Jews hated Samaritans? Or was that just the more popular like notion between them? Because he could have been one of the ones that didn't.
To me, the way it's presented in the Bible, he would have been a very small minority of people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If this Jewish man woke up and was like, "Oh, hey, cool, you're a Samaritan," I feel like it would have been, because when you look at when Jesus travels to Samaria, they actually say Jewish people would travel
around
extra days to avoid Samaria altogether. Right? It's one thing where I don't like you, but I'll just drive quickly through your block. It's another thing, I don't like you, so I'm gonna drive around your block. Right? That's a different level of prejudice for a group of people. I dislike you so much, I'm not going to go into your nation.
Yeah.
Right? Even though it will save time when we're talking, you got to
and you're traveling on foot.
Right. And you're like, "Nah, I want to get my steps in. I'm going around." Right? So I understand the point you're making, but
Yeah.
I do feel he'd be in
Yeah, very small
a
majority.
very small minority,
Minority.
right? And again, I mean, the Bible doesn't talk about it, but I always
Yeah.
wonder, the interruption of the Samaritan does not only affect him, it affects this Jewish man,
Mhm.
right? Um, the priest who you think would have saved him doesn't,
Mhm.
right? The temple assistant, the intern, whatever, you think he would have helped, but he doesn't. But that's kind of just where these two guys are.
I think that also could have been a point as to why he used them in the parable, because it was like a man of stature that was asking this question as well, and like as Jesus knows, as he has experienced in his lifetime, his physical lifetime, a lot of times those men of stature didn't look at anyone that was below them.
And that kind of brings me to, I guess, the heart of the story, right? And the heart of what Jesus is trying to get to, right? Because you see here the religious expert, when the Bible describes his question of who's my neighbor, it's he's trying to justify his actions, right? The Bible doesn't say what his actions are,
Yep.
right? But it can be inferred, right, from the passage that he's trying to justify. He probably did something similar to the priest or the temple assistant. He saw someone in need, looked away, crossed the street, kept it going.
Yeah.
Could not be bothered, could not be stopped, even though he was a person in a position to easily maybe help this other person. Right? So my question now is, how does only loving those who are lovable fail to reflect the way God has loved us in Jesus?
Because he's loved us even when we weren't lovable.
Okay.
And he doesn't call you to only love the people that are lovable. He calls you to love everyone. So it's not a matter of who you choose to love. It's who you should be loving, and which is the vast majority, regardless of the fact that they don't look like you, they don't act like you, they don't smell like you. Like regardless.
Okay.
I think this is like a lesson I've always learned from my parents growing up, and they would always say, it's always the people that are easily lovable that would be the first ones to walk away from you if you were in trouble. Sometimes it's the people that you find it hard to love that will show the most kindness when it's needed. So that's why you should always like be like humble.
I agree with what both of you are saying. Now let's take it a step further and say, it's easy, I feel, to say that.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
How easy is it to actually live that way? Right? Meaning, when you are confronted with someone who has been beaten and stripped naked, right? How easy is it for you to get down in the dirt with them, pick them up, and clean them off? Metaphorically, hopefully.
It's definitely way easier said than done, but it is one of those things that you have to constantly like make a conscious effort to practice within your life. So it could be like the first time you come across something that severe, you do walk away because you don't have the physical capabilities, like you don't have the facilities to help them. But down the block you can see someone that is like begging for like some food or like some money to buy something to eat, that you can say, okay, well, I couldn't help that one, so I'm going to use what I can to help this one. And like you can kind of build it up within baby steps, because you can't just jump off a cliff without having rolled down a hill. I don't question, but like, you know what I mean? Like the height thing.
We're gonna
You mean-
circle
Have you
back
never
to
rolled
that.
down a
You mean,
hill?
wait, what? Do you mean like not having a parachute?
No.
Uh,
Like, cliff diving versus
Yeah.
like rolling down a grassy hill. Have you never done that?
No.
We used to do that at camp all the time.
Okay, I've rolled down a hill.
Yeah.
I don't understand the parallel, between you have to roll down a hill first before you can jump off a cliff.
Because
They
they're
are not
very
the same
different
thing.
heights.
But they're not the same. Asha,
I mean, go ahead.
how easy is it to love people that are unlovable?
That's why you looked away. I thought you were gonna ask me the cliff question.
No,
So I'm asking.
We're done with this. We're done with that
You're not even
question.
practicing what you
We're done with
preach.
Yeah,
that
I'm
question. We're done. I'm done with this interruption. We're moving on.
So as you can see, I like to practice what I say sometimes, and I know it's harder to do versus say, but I like to try.
Can you repeat the analogy of the question?
I said you can't jump off a cliff without having like roll down a hill first.
Can you repeat your question? Because now I'm just thinking of the cliff thing.
Is
yeah,
it because
let's just.
it's like both high, like with the height? So it's like
Exactly.
scary before you roll down a hill. So you feel that adrenaline.
Exactly.
You got it. At least I understand.
Thank you.
That's like you gotta run fast before you driving a car fast. I don't.
No, it's not.
Just
They have
because
no-
you can't
'cause they have no-
understand doesn't mean it's wrong.
Asha, the question is,
Mhm.
how easy is it? Though we know we should love the unlovable, how easy is it to do that in reality?
How easy is it to not love the?
Either one, is it difficult? Is it easy? When it actually comes to that interruption of there is someone unlovable in front of you,
Mhm.
how easy or difficult is it to actually show them love?
Well, I think as Ariel said, it does take. You have to like sort of make a conscious effort to do that because I think that it is obviously easier to just not and just go about your day and not even have that interruption. So I think that it definitely takes um it takes what's the word that I'm looking for?
Practice, perseverance,
No,
effort.
it takes yeah.
What's the vibe we're going for?
I don't know. The word is like in my brain, but I just can't.
How do we define it? What's the description?
Discipline.
Discipline.
Discipline. There you go. Takes discipline.
You know, it doesn't take discipline. Rolling down a hill. So one of the things, right, that I was thinking when I could get past her analogy was
Haters gonna hate. You're just gonna let them.
I think, and to your point of discipline, and I think you were using the word practice also, the idea that I think wherever our boundary between someone is lovable and unlovable is, the more we are around the unlovable and practice showing them love and have the discipline to actually show them love, I think that boundary moves. So the person who was unlovable today is lovable tomorrow for us when we encounter that next person, right? And I think that's one of the things where what we've been talking about for like the last few weeks on the podcast in general is just the idea of experiencing God, right? I think this idea of the unlovable becoming lovable is by experiencing God, right? It's by, as you said before, right? There was a time when, by definition, to God, we were unlovable, right? Because of our sin, yet He loved us, right? If you look at the Beatitudes, there, the second one says, God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted, right? And I know a lot of times we think that just means the grieving process and things like that. But when you look at it within the full context, you begin to see it's actually this idea of Jesus is talking not just about loss of life, but He is talking about you're mourning over sin, right? You realize the sins you've committed, but you also realize the state the world's in, right? And you realize there are people who are never going to experience God's love and mercy, right? So when I think of that beatitude and I think of what Jesus is saying here, I start to think these interruptions in life, right? Which really and truly are interruptions for us, but may very well just be on God's end, it's his plan,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think these become moments where we can start to sort of see the heart of God, right? In a way that you sometimes don't see if you're only around the lovable people, the people who make it easy, right? I think there's sometimes we need to have that interruption of, hey, I need to be around someone that's unlovable just to, because Christ died for them too. He didn't just die for the priest and the temple assistant and the religious expert. He died for everyone, right? Um, I mean, I don't know how many of us that are here. Before COVID, we had gone to a few like family shelters and things like that. And I think we went to one that was like specifically for kids, right? And I know, again, before COVID, um, the men's ministry in our church would invite men from like a men's homeless shelter here for a meal and things like that. And one of the things that was always interesting is when they are talking about the experience and like, hey, it was really nice you guys invited us. Um, One of the guys said something which kind of stuck out to me. He's like, hey, people have brought us stuff before. People have brought us food. People have brought us whatever. But when he came to our church, it was the first time that the people that were inviting him sat with him, right? And in that moment, I realized something. I was like, oh, this is what the Good Samaritan story is about, right? It's about getting down to sometimes the same level as someone that might be unlovable, right? I also think of, and you guys can kind of chime in, because as I think about it, I think of Jesus is always sort of having these public meals with known sinners, right? Jesus is not really recorded having a lot of meals with um, the religious scholars of his day, right? The only religious, I mean, when he has religious encounters, it's like this: they're trying to trap him in something.
Yep.
The only good conversation, I think, was with Nicodemus, and even then, that was like at night in secret,
Yeah.
right? So, what do you guys think about what Jesus is really trying to say here about loving the unlovable, right? Not necessarily how is it easy or is it hard, but I think what do you think of the priority he is placing on it? As you look at his life, as you look at the story, right? Because I'm pretty sure Jesus could have explained who your neighbor is a million ways. He chose to explain it that way.
It's definitely one of the higher things on the list of like his priorities, because everywhere he goes it's like he's talking to the untouchables, or like literally with the lepers and everything, he's literally talking to the untouchables, he's healing them, he's making them, like, he's showing them love and he's showing them grace, um, for regardless of whatever it was that they've done in the past. He's showing them that, like, yeah, you might have done these things in the past, but that's not who you are in me. Like, that's who you were before you knew of my love and my mercy on your life.
When I hearing the story, it just made me think of like, like in the movies where there's like a popular clique and then there's like the people who are, I don't know, nerdy or whatever. And then it's like yeah, it makes me think of like uh them going to like actually hang out with those people that
Mm.
are like not of their clique. So I guess like the lovables hanging out with the unlovables. Um, and I think that by doing that, not only does it usually in the movies, I feel like it leads by example. Like other people start to see what you're doing and they're like, oh, okay, maybe I should reach out in this way and help. And you never know, like in that one little thing that you're doing, how much you're affecting that person's life and, causing a chain reaction.
There was this thing on Instagram a while ago. I don't remember like how long or what it was, but there was like this one lonely kid in school, right? He always ate lunch by himself or whatever. And then this group of friends just came by and sat with him and they were like just having lunch, including him in the conversation. And then the next day he baked them cookies because he was like, "I thank you for sitting with me. Like no one ever sits with me." And then they actually became like really good friends as a result of it. And there were probably like there's nothing like there was no reason for other people not to sit with him other than the fact that no one sat with him initially.
Yeah, I definitely think to what both of you saying, there's sometimes people are just looking for that one person who will sometimes have the courage and the boldness to take that step of loving the unlovable. And one of the other things that kind of comes to my mind, right, is, and I'm going to try to say this carefully because I don't want to get myself in trouble, right? I think if you didn't know, when the Bible talks about how God separates us from our sins, it's described as it's as far as the east is from the west, right? Now, that's great. For me personally, one of the things is that I don't want to forget the sinner I was, right? Not because I want to dwell in that place, but Romans 5:8 says, "But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners," which I think was like one of the first things you said in today's episode. And for me, it is humbling to say, okay, look at where I am now. Look at where I once was. And now, oh, that person may be unlovable now, but let's think of where, if God could take me from the things I was doing and bring me here, what can God do in this person's life? And maybe the reason that this interruption is happening, this, whatever you want to call it, right? God's will for me to meet this person may very well be for me to show God's love to this person, right? This may be the only time that they ever see it, right? So I think the goal then is to now say, okay, I'm not going to be the priest, the religious expert, the temple assistant, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing to be a priest or to excel in understanding the Bible and God's word, but rather don't allow a head knowledge of Christ and a sort of a self-righteousness stop you from sharing God's love with others. Any final thoughts?
No.
She said no, so you don't have to say anything.
Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
All right, guys. That's been another episode of Pursue. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't,
I'm sorry.
I don't know what to tell you.
I enjoyed it.